A billionaire kicked out his girlfriend, then found her living with his biggest rival. Alexander Pierce's life was a fortress of ambition and control. The towering walls he had built around himself were made of cold, calculated decisions, shielding him from the vulnerability he feared most. Grace Carter was the light that had managed to seep through the cracks, her warmth contrasting with the icy demeanor of the billionaire. Their relationship was an unlikely fusion of fire and ice, her unwavering belief in love clashing against his relentless pursuit of success. Despite their passion, the cracks in their union began to show, subtle at first, but widening with every unspoken conflict. Grace, ever hopeful, poured her heart into supporting Alexander, believing that beneath his steel exterior lay a man capable of change. She sacrificed her dreams and stifled her frustrations, silently waiting for him to recognize the love she so freely gave. But as the days turned into months, her patience grew thin, each passing moment chipping away at the foundation of their fragile connection. The tension between them reached its peak as Alexander faced the immense pressure of a failing business deal. The weight of the potential loss consumed him, leaving him paranoid and short-tempered. Grace could feel the emotional distance growing, the man she once loved slipping further away as he buried himself in work. She tried, time and again, to pierce through his walls, but Alexander's fear of appearing weak only pushed her further out of reach. Their home, once a haven of passion and promise, became a battlefield of unspoken resentments and mounting frustrations. One evening, the storm that had been brewing between them erupted. Grace, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and despair, confronted Alexander about his relentless workaholic tendencies. She begged him to see what his obsession was doing, not just to their relationship, but to himself. But Alexander, blinded by stress and pride, misinterpreted her intentions. The accusations fell like daggers, his words cutting deep as he questioned her love, insinuating that her loyalty was tied to his wealth and power. Grace's heart shattered, but she stood her ground, defending the love and sacrifices she had made for him. Their argument escalated, the room heavy with unspoken truths and years of suppressed emotion. And then, in a moment of reckless anger, Alexander made the decision that would change everything. He demanded that Grace leave his home, his voice cold and final. Heartbroken, Grace packed a small suitcase and walked out of the life they had built together. The mansion's grand doors closed behind her, leaving her standing in the cold, her heart heavy with the weight of Alexander's dismissal. For Alexander, the act of pushing her away was both a shield and a sword, his pride masking the pain he refused to confront. As the night descended, he convinced himself that he had made the right choice, even as the emptiness of her absence began to settle in. Grace found herself alone and adrift, the world she had known reduced to a suitcase and a series of uncertain tomorrows. Her mind raced as she wandered the unfamiliar streets, searching for a place to stay. Memories of the life she had left behind played in her mind, a bittersweet reminder of the sacrifices she had made to stand by Alexander's side. Yet, even in her despair, a spark of resilience began to flicker. Grace had always been strong, though her strength had been tested in ways she could never have imagined. She found a temporary refuge in a small, run-down apartment, its peeling walls and dim lighting a stark contrast to the luxurious life she had shared with Alexander. There, in the quiet solitude of her new reality, Grace began to reflect on the dreams she had set aside. Among them was an entrepreneurial project she had once been passionate about, a vision she had abandoned to prioritize Alexander's needs. Now, with nothing to lose, she dusted off those old ideas, drafting plans late into the night. Doubts about her ability to succeed crept in, but Grace clung to the hope that rebuilding her life on her own terms would be worth the struggle. Just as Grace began to find her footing, a figure from Alexander's world entered her orbit. Ethan Cross, Alexander's most cunning and charismatic business rival, approached her with an offer. Ethan had heard whispers of Grace's departure and saw an opportunity to weave her into his plans. His charm was undeniable and his offer tempting, a place to stay, and the resources to pursue her business idea. For Grace, the prospect of stability and support was too alluring to ignore. But as she weighed Ethan's proposal, she couldn't shake the feeling that his motives might not be as pure as they seemed. Grace reluctantly accepted Ethan's offer, moving into his sleek penthouse that felt both inviting and intimidating. The modern luxury of his home stood in stark contrast to the small, humble apartment she had been calling her refuge. Ethan, with his smooth charisma and seemingly genuine encouragement, positioned himself as a mentor and ally. He saw potential in Grace's business idea, offering not just resources but also guidance to bring her vision to life. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. Yet, a small voice in the back of her mind warned her to remain cautious. Ethan's interest in her seemed layered, and she couldn't fully decipher his intentions. Still, desperate to rebuild her life, she chose to focus on the opportunities in front of her rather than the potential traps lurking beneath them. Unbeknownst to Grace, word of her partnership with Ethan quickly reached Alexander. At first, he dismissed the rumors as exaggerations, gossip meant to provoke him. But when photographs of Grace with Ethan surfaced, the images cut through Alexander's carefully constructed facade. Seeing her smile in Ethan's company ignited a storm of emotions he had buried deep within. Regret, anger, and jealousy consumed him as he struggled to understand why Grace would align herself with the one man he considered his greatest enemy. The notion that Ethan, always the opportunist, might be using Grace as a pawn only added fuel to Alexander's growing obsession. As Alexander grappled with his emotions, Grace began to see subtle cracks in Ethan's carefully polished exterior. Though he was supportive, his encouragement often carried an undertone of manipulation. He was always calculated, steering their conversations in ways that subtly positioned her against Alexander. Grace couldn't deny that Ethan had been instrumental in helping her regain her confidence, but she began to question whether his support was truly selfless or another move in his endless game of one-upmanship with Alexander. Her heart, still fragile from the breakup, remained conflicted. Memories of Alexander, both the love they had shared and the pain he had caused, lingered in her mind, making it difficult to fully embrace her new reality. Meanwhile, Alexander's descent into desperation deepened. Accustomed to winning in every aspect of his life, he found himself unraveling at the thought of losing Grace for good. He attempted grand gestures, sending gifts and messages meant to convey his regret, but each attempt only seemed to push her further away. Grace, determined to stand on her own, rejected his overtures with a cold finality that left Alexander reeling. His pride had always been his armor, but now it felt like a weight dragging him down. The final breaking point came during a public confrontation. Alexander, driven by his emotions, approached Grace at a networking event where she was presenting her startup. The room fell silent as the two faced off, their unresolved tension palpable to everyone present. Alexander's arrogance and desperation collided, leading him to plead his case in front of an audience. But Grace, with newfound strength and clarity, called him out for his past behavior, refusing to let him use his wealth and influence to manipulate her. Her words cut deeper than any business loss Alexander had ever faced, forcing him to confront a truth he had long avoided. He had driven away the one person who had truly loved him for who he was, not for what he had. As the event ended, Grace walked away, her confidence shining through the pain that still lingered beneath the surface. Alexander was left standing alone, grappling with the reality of his mistakes. The encounter marked a turning point for both of them, as Grace continued to rise, building a life defined by independence and resilience, while Alexander faced a long road toward redemption. Grace hesitated, her mind torn between the fear of making another mistake and the pressing need to move forward. Ethan Cross's offer was a lifeline, but accepting it felt like stepping into uncharted territory. His penthouse, sleek and luxurious, was a world away from the modest apartment she had grown accustomed to. The pristine surfaces and cold elegance seemed almost oppressive at first, a stark reminder of the life she had left behind. But Ethan's calm and steady demeanor contrasted sharply with Alexander's intensity. He didn't demand anything from her, didn't push her into corners where she felt trapped. Instead, he provided her with the kind of quiet support she hadn't realized she craved. Though her heart remained guarded, her desperation outweighed her unease, and she reluctantly stepped into this new chapter under Ethan's roof. Ethan's belief in Grace was almost disarming. He saw her not as someone broken by the past, but as a force yet to be fully realized. With a sharp eye for potential, he encouraged her to revisit the entrepreneurial dream she had abandoned long ago. He presented her with resources, connections, and strategies, mentoring her with an uncanny knack for knowing when to push and when to hold back. Grace found herself rediscovering the passion that had once driven her. Yet, the wounds from her breakup with Alexander lingered, casting shadows over her newfound purpose. At night, when the city's lights danced outside the penthouse windows, memories of Alexander would surface unbidden. His touch, his voice, the promises he had once whispered. She buried those thoughts beneath her work, determined not to let her past define her future. Meanwhile, whispers of Grace's partnership with Ethan began to circulate, eventually reaching Alexander's ears. At first, he dismissed the rumors with a bitter laugh, chalking them up to baseless gossip meant to rile him. But when an associate placed undeniable photographic evidence on his desk, Grace stepping out of Ethan's car, her smile bright and unguarded, it felt like a punch to the gut. A storm of emotions raged within him. Jealousy that Ethan had succeeded where he had failed, anger at the thought of Grace aligning herself with his rival, and a deep, unshakable sense of loss. He stared at the photographs for what felt like hours, unable to reconcile the woman he loved with the reality before him. The betrayal he imagined cut deeper than any business defeat he had ever suffered. For Alexander, this wasn't just about Grace. It was about Ethan. Their rivalry was more than professional. It was personal. Flashbacks of their tangled history surfaced, each memory sharpening his resentment. Ethan had always been the charming opportunist, the kind of man who thrived on exploiting others' weaknesses. To see Grace by his side felt like the ultimate affront, a reminder of how thoroughly Alexander had failed her. Consumed by pride and bitterness, he convinced himself that Grace's alliance with Ethan was a deliberate act of betrayal, a move designed to undermine him both personally and professionally. Ethan, on the other hand, was playing a far more calculated game. His support for Grace was genuine in many ways. He admired her resilience, her intelligence, and her drive. But beneath his encouragement lay a deeper agenda. Every move he made was meticulously planned. Each kind word and helpful gesture carefully designed to position Grace as both a valuable ally and a strategic asset. He reveled in the irony of the situation, knowing that every step Grace took toward success under his guidance would drive Alexander further into despair. Grace, still piecing herself together, remained unaware of Ethan's layered intentions. She saw only the man who had offered her a chance when no one else would, and for that, she was grateful. In time, Grace's presence began to transform Ethan's penthouse. The sterile, impersonal space gradually filled with warmth and life. Her laughter echoed through the halls, and the once empty corners of the apartment became adorned with her touches, paintings, plants, and little signs of her growing confidence. Ethan found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't anticipated. Moments of vulnerability passed between them, fleeting but significant. Yet, despite the comfort she began to find in this new world, memories of Alexander continued to tug at her heart. She couldn't help but compare the two men, their strengths, their flaws, the way they made her feel. The scars Alexander had left behind hadn't fully healed, and she wondered if they ever truly would. Alexander's life, in contrast, had become a lonely, hollow shell. The grandeur of his mansion, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a suffocating prison. The absence of Grace's presence left him unsettled, and the silence in the room seemed deafening. Alone in the vastness of his home, he found himself tormented by memories of the times they had shared, the laughter, the tenderness, the way she had looked at him with unwavering belief in his potential. It was impossible to escape the gnawing feeling that he had driven her away with his own hands. Guilt settled heavily in his chest, a constant companion. His earlier certainty that Grace would always be there, that she would endure his flaws and ambitions, now seemed naive. What had he truly given her, beyond the superficial comfort of wealth and status? The more he reflected on it, the more it seemed like nothing of real substance. As the days passed, the weight of his regret grew unbearable. His obsession with Grace's absence took root, clouding his judgment and distracting him from everything else. He tried to bury himself in his work, to silence the pain by drowning it in business deals and strategies. But nothing worked. Every update he received about Grace's progress with Ethan felt like a dagger to his heart. The sharpness of his jealousy mixed with a haunting realization. He had pushed her away, and now she was flourishing without him. The success she was finding with Ethan only served to amplify the fear that he had not just lost her, but had done so irreparably. She wasn't just a part of his life. She had been the part that made him feel human, the one person who had seen through his cold exterior. One evening, as he stood at his office window, staring out at the city, the truth finally broke through. He had been so consumed by pride, so terrified of vulnerability, that he had lost the one thing he couldn't afford to: Grace's love and trust. The realization was both devastating and clarifying. If he truly wanted to make amends, if he wanted any chance at redemption, he would have to humble himself, confront his mistakes, and face the woman he had wronged. The thought of seeing her again filled him with a mix of fear and hope. Fear that she would never forgive him, and hope that maybe, just maybe, she had begun to see through the walls he had built around himself. This marked the moment when Alexander decided, with a fierce resolve, to win Grace back. He would confront her, no longer as the arrogant man who had demanded everything, but as someone who had learned the painful cost of losing what he had taken for granted. He knew that it would not be easy. Grace had changed. She was no longer the woman who had quietly sacrificed her dreams for him. She had found her own strength, and that frightened him. But he couldn't just let her go. She deserved more than the hollow version of himself he had been offering. He had to prove to her that he could be the man she had always believed in, if she would give him the chance. With a deep breath, Alexander prepared for the meeting, unaware of how much Grace had evolved since their parting. The tension between them would be palpable, but this time it was no longer just about power or pride. It was about love, redemption, and the possibility of healing a broken bond. As he made his plans to see her, Alexander realized that this moment, this confrontation, would be the true test of his transformation. He had spent so long building empires, but now he would have to rebuild the one thing he had truly lost: her trust. The stage was set, and the stakes had never been higher. Alexander's heart raced as he walked into Ethan's office, anticipating the inevitable confrontation that would follow. But what he wasn't prepared for was the sight of Grace standing tall, exuding confidence and commanding the room. She was a different woman from the one he had left behind, strong, independent, and thriving in a way that both captivated and unsettled him. The warmth he had once known in her eyes was gone, replaced with a coldness that sliced through the air between them. As he met her gaze, he struggled to reconcile this version of Grace with the woman who had once been his world. Her success was a blow to his pride, a reminder of what he had let slip through his fingers, and a growing tension simmered in the room. The interaction that followed was strained. Grace's demeanor was distant, guarded, as though she were intentionally keeping him at arm's length. Her every word felt measured, calculated, as if she were playing a role, one that was nothing like the woman he had once known. Ethan, ever the provocateur, subtly mocked Alexander's vulnerability, offering a stark contrast to the coldness that Grace now embodied. As the three of them stood there, the tension was palpable, but it was Grace who felt the most torn. The presence of both men, the ones who had once been so central to her life, pulled her in opposing directions, her heart aching as she navigated the remnants of her past and the present that was slowly suffocating her. Ethan, sensing an opportunity, seized the moment to escalate the rivalry. With a well-timed remark about Grace's contributions to his success, He subtly twisted the knife in Alexander's pride. The subtle jab about her role in his empire, in contrast to the helplessness Alexander had always felt about sharing control, only deepened the tension. Ethan's plan was clear: to destabilize Alexander's carefully constructed world and to pull Grace deeper into his orbit. The high-stakes business challenge he laid before Alexander was a dangerous gamble, one that had the potential to shatter everything Alexander had worked for. As the conversation shifted to business, Alexander could feel the power dynamic slipping through his fingers, his empire teetering on the edge, and Grace's growing influence in Ethan's world only further unsettled him. The more he watched Ethan use Grace's talents to advance his own agenda, the more he realized how fragile his own position had become. A quiet wave of regret washed over Alexander as he watched Grace speak with ease and command, her once-hidden talents now fully on display. Every word she spoke, every confident move she made, reminded him of how much he had dismissed her potential when they were together. Flashbacks of their time together flooded his mind. When Grace had tried to share her ideas, her dreams, and he had brushed them aside in favor of his own ambitions. The realization that he had not only lost her love, but had also failed to see her for who she truly was hit him hard. The cracks in his confidence began to show, the foundations of his self-assured persona starting to crumble under the weight of his own flaws. Alexander was no longer the unshakable titan he had once believed himself to be. His empire was crumbling, and the only thing that remained constant was the gnawing regret that Grace had once believed in him, and he had let her down. Behind closed doors, Ethan was not content with simply undermining Alexander's professional life. He was playing a far deeper game. His rivalry with Alexander wasn't just about business. It was about proving his superiority as a man. In a private conversation with an associate, Ethan revealed his true motivations, outlining his desire to not only defeat Alexander in the boardroom, but to take everything from him. Grace, in Ethan's eyes, was the perfect weapon, a symbol of his triumph over Alexander, a prize that would solidify his place as the dominant force in both business and in Grace's life. The more he fed Grace's growing success and manipulated her to align with his plans, the more he saw her as a tool to exact revenge on Alexander. Subtle signs of Ethan's manipulation began to emerge, but Grace, still healing and focused on her own journey, remained blind to the depths of his scheming. As Grace continued to thrive in her new environment, her emotional turmoil began to surface. Memories of her time with Alexander resurfaced, and with them came a flood of conflicting emotions. She couldn't ignore the pain of their breakup, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the growing strength she had found within herself. Yet, doubts lingered. Was her partnership with Ethan truly about her own ambitions, or was it a subconscious attempt to prove something to Alexander, to hurt him in the only way she knew how? In moments of solitude, Grace wrestled with these emotions, torn between her desire for independence and the unresolved feelings that still tied her to her past. The more she worked with Ethan, the more she began to question whether her motivations were entirely her own or shaped by the complicated history she shared with Alexander. Desperate to regain Grace's attention and to prove his worth, Alexander resorted to grand gestures, lavish gifts, public declarations of remorse, and attempts to control the narrative of their breakup. His actions, however, only pushed Grace further away. She saw these gestures not as signs of genuine change, but as hollow attempts to regain control over a situation he had already lost. Each time he tried to reach her, to show her the man he believed he had become, she only grew more frustrated. Alexander's arrogance and inability to truly understand her needs only reignited the anger that had been simmering inside of her. Their confrontation in the public eye was nothing short of explosive. Grace, unable to hold back her pent-up emotions, delivered a scathing rebuke that left Alexander reeling. For the first time, he saw the full extent of the damage he had caused, not just to their relationship but to the person Grace had become. Ethan, sensing an opportunity in the wake of Alexander's failures, tightened his grip on Grace, offering her the validation and emotional support that she had longed for. Where Alexander had been distant, consumed by his empire, Ethan was present, attentive, and perceptive. He knew exactly what Grace needed to feel seen and heard, and he provided it, wrapping her in a sense of safety that had been missing from her life. Slowly but surely, Grace began to lean on Ethan, her emotional reliance growing as she allowed him to be her anchor in this storm of uncertainty. Yet, in her vulnerability, she remained unaware of Ethan's true intentions. His kindness was a mask for the deeper motivations that lay beneath the surface, a manipulation that was so subtle, she failed to recognize it as it unfolded. As Grace leaned further into her new partnership with Ethan, she continued to pour herself into her work, taking greater risks and seizing opportunities that she would have once dismissed. With Ethan by her side, she felt more capable than ever, but with each step forward, a lingering sense of unease followed her. The space that had once been sterile and cold now began to take on the warmth and vibrancy of Grace's presence. Her creative touch transformed Ethan's penthouse into a home, a place that reflected not just her talent, but the woman she had become in the wake of her breakup with Alexander. Yet, despite this new chapter in her life, memories of Alexander continued to haunt her. The man she had once loved, the man who had shaped her, lingered in the corners of her mind. She couldn't completely let go of the past, no matter how hard she tried. Alexander, on the other hand, was consumed by guilt. His once grand mansion, now empty and silent, echoed with the weight of his mistakes. The luxury that surrounded him meant nothing without the one person who had made it all meaningful. He found himself replaying the moments they had shared, the laughter, the tenderness, the love he had once taken for granted. Flashbacks of Grace, her bright eyes full of hope and trust, only deepened his sense of loss. The realization that he had pushed her away, not just because of his ambition, but because of his own insecurities, was a bitter pill to swallow. The isolation he felt now was a direct result of his own arrogance, and it ate away at him. Alone in his mansion, Alexander wrestled with the truth. His pursuit of power had cost him everything that truly mattered. His empire, once a symbol of his success, now seemed meaningless. He had pushed the one person who had made him feel human out of his life, and now he had to reckon with the consequences. Obsessed with Grace's absence, Alexander found himself unable to focus on his work. His mind constantly returned to thoughts of her, of what they had once shared and what he had lost. It wasn't just her presence that he missed. It was the emotional anchor she had been in his life. As he tracked her progress with Ethan, each update served as a reminder of his own failures. He had underestimated her, dismissed her ambitions, and let his pride stand in the way of what could have been. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Grace wasn't just a part of his life. She was the part that had made him feel alive. The deeper Alexander sank into his obsession, the more he realized how much he needed her, not just for the sake of their relationship, but to restore something within himself that had been lost in his blind pursuit of power. Determined to make things right, Alexander finally decided to confront Grace. This time, he wasn't going to make empty promises or grand gestures. He had spent too long trying to control their relationship, to mold it into something it wasn't. Now, he was ready to prove to her that he had changed, that he could support her dreams, not as a way to win her back, but as a way to show her that he had finally learned to value the woman she had always been. As Alexander prepared for their meeting, he was unaware of just how much Grace had changed since their parting. She was no longer the woman who would fall for his grand gestures or his promises of a better future. The new Grace was independent, strong, and focused on building something for herself, something that didn't rely on him or anyone else. The section closes with a sense of impending collision. Grace stands at a crossroads, torn between two men, one who represents her past and the other her future. She is no longer the woman who would sacrifice herself for Alexander, but neither is she the naive dreamer who once believed in his promises. Ethan's manipulations, while subtle, have planted seeds of doubt, and as much as Grace is drawn to him, she is also beginning to see through the cracks in his seemingly perfect persona. Alexander, determined to prove that he can change, is preparing for the fight of his life, not just to win Grace back, but to reclaim the parts of himself he had lost in his pursuit of power. As the storm of love, power, and revenge brews around them, the future remains uncertain, and each step taken brings them closer to an inevitable clash that will change everything. Alexander, surrounded by the cold, sterile walls of his private estate, found himself face to face with the ghosts of his past. His mansion, a symbol of his success, now seemed hollow and empty. The luxurious surroundings did nothing to fill the void that had been created by his own toxic behavior. He spent long hours reflecting on the choices he had made, on the countless moments where his pride, his obsession with power, and his inability to open his heart had hurt those closest to him. Grace's absence weighed heavily on his soul, and as he replayed their time together, he began to acknowledge the ways in which he had failed her. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He had been blind to her needs, dismissive of her dreams, and cold in the face of her love. The weight of this realization was suffocating, and it shook him to his core. For the first time, Alexander faced the truth of his own flaws, recognizing that his arrogance and emotional detachment had left scars on everyone around him, especially Grace. The once powerful and unyielding businessman was now a man broken by his own mistakes, grappling with a deep sense of regret. Determined to change, Alexander set out to break free from the destructive patterns that had defined his life for so long. He knew that he couldn't undo the past, but he could begin to take meaningful steps toward becoming a better person. His first action was to reach out to his employees, those who had suffered under his harsh leadership. He made the decision to apologize, to acknowledge the hurt he had caused, and to make amends. His efforts to rebuild trust within his company were met with mixed reactions, but Alexander persisted, determined to show that he was more than just a ruthless businessman. His journey of self-improvement didn't stop there. He delved into books on emotional intelligence, seeking to understand himself and others on a deeper level. Alexander also reached out to a trusted confidant, someone he respected, and asked for guidance. For the first time in his life, he was truly vulnerable, admitting that he needed help. It was a humbling experience, but one that showed Alexander he was committed to changing, not just for himself, but for the people he had wronged, particularly Grace. He wasn't just trying to win her back. He was trying to prove to himself that he could be a better person. Meanwhile, Grace's journey was taking a different turn. With Ethan's mentorship, she was beginning to carve out a name for herself as an entrepreneur. The startup that she had long shelved was now a reality, and it was gaining attention for its innovative approach. Grace's business was rapidly growing, and she was earning accolades in entrepreneurial circles for her vision and determination. It was a validation of her decision to prioritize her ambitions over her relationship with Alexander. She felt a renewed sense of purpose, and for the first time in a long while, she was truly thriving in her professional life. Still, the emotional wounds from her past were far from healed. As her business flourished, she grappled with the remnants of her relationship with Alexander. Though she was focused on her career, her unresolved feelings for him were never far from her mind. The success she had achieved in business was a bittersweet reminder of the cost of her independence. She had worked so hard to reclaim her own identity, but it came at the expense of something she had once cherished. Yet, as Grace's professional life blossomed, cracks began to form in Ethan's facade. At first, he had been the supportive mentor, the one who believed in her potential when no one else did. But as their partnership deepened, Grace started to notice subtle changes in Ethan's behavior. He became increasingly possessive, framing his actions as protective, but creating an undercurrent of unease. He would make decisions for her, even without consulting her, always positioning himself as the one who knew what was best for her. While Grace had initially felt a sense of gratitude and admiration for Ethan, this growing possessiveness made her uncomfortable. She began to question whether Ethan's support for her was truly driven by a belief in her potential, or if it was part of a calculated effort to use her to his advantage, especially in his rivalry with Alexander. The more she observed his behavior, the more she realized that his motives were far from pure. The realization was unsettling, and it left Grace questioning everything she thought she knew about her partnership with him. As the tension between Grace and Ethan began to grow, Alexander, who had been observing the developments from a distance, took a bold step to demonstrate his transformation. Determined to show Grace that he had changed, he publicly stepped back from a major business deal, one that would have dealt a crushing blow to a smaller competitor. In doing so, he made the decision to prioritize compassion over profit for the first time in his life. It was a move that stunned the business world, as Alexander's reputation had always been tied to his cutthroat approach. Some admired his decision, recognizing it as a rare act of integrity, while others criticized him, questioning whether it was a genuine change or merely a strategic maneuver. Regardless of the external reaction, Alexander remained focused on proving that he was more than just a ruthless businessman. This public act of redemption caught Grace's attention, though she remained skeptical. She couldn't help but notice the shift in Alexander's behavior, but she also wondered if this was just another attempt to manipulate the narrative, to control the situation the way he always had. While Grace grappled with her conflicting feelings, Ethan, emboldened by her success and her increasing dependence on him, took a dangerous step. He confessed his romantic feelings for her, making it clear that he viewed their partnership as something destined to evolve into a personal relationship. Grace was taken aback by his sudden declaration. She hadn't expected Ethan to cross that line, especially given their professional dynamic. His confession left her feeling cornered and conflicted. She had always viewed their partnership as a means to rebuild her life, a way to prove her worth outside of her relationship with Alexander. But now, Ethan was pushing for more, suggesting that their relationship could become not just professional but personal, and more lucrative if they were to unite romantically. This sudden shift in their dynamic unsettled Grace. She had always been careful with her emotions, wary of letting anyone, whether Alexander or Ethan, gain too much control over her life. Now, with Ethan's declaration, she found herself questioning whether she had misjudged him all along. It was in the midst of this emotional turmoil that Grace's awakening began. As she reflected on her partnership with Ethan, she started to see the truth that had been slowly unfolding before her eyes. She remembered moments when Ethan had subtly manipulated her decisions, always framing his actions as being in her best interest, when in reality, they were often driven by his rivalry with Alexander. His possessiveness had grown more apparent, and the lines between professional mentorship and personal control had become increasingly blurred. For the first time, Grace recognized that she was being used as a pawn in a game of power and revenge. This realization was a turning point for her. She had worked so hard to build her independence, to reclaim her identity, and she refused to let herself be manipulated again, whether by Alexander or Ethan. With newfound clarity, Grace made the decision to step back from Ethan, asserting her independence once more. She would no longer allow herself to be part of someone else's vendetta, especially not at the cost of her own dreams. Meanwhile, Alexander, with his newfound self-awareness, reached out to Grace, hoping to prove that he had changed. He requested a private meeting, and this time, his intentions were clear. Gone were the grand gestures and the attempts to control the narrative. Instead, Alexander delivered a heartfelt and sincere apology, one that came from a place of genuine remorse. He admitted to his flaws, his pride, and the ways in which he had hurt her. For the first time, he spoke not just of his love for her, but of his regret for the pain he had caused. He didn't offer any promises of reconciliation, nor did he ask for her forgiveness. Instead, he offered his resources, his influence, and his unwavering support for her dreams, without any expectation of anything in return. It was a moment of true vulnerability, one that touched Grace deeply. She saw the man before her, not as the ruthless businessman she had once known, but as someone who had finally learned to acknowledge his mistakes and seek redemption. As Grace listened to Alexander's words, she was moved, but her heart remained guarded. She had fought so hard to protect her independence, to reclaim her sense of self. And while Alexander's apology stirred something deep within her, she couldn't shake the doubt that lingered in her mind. Was this truly a sign of his transformation, or was it just another attempt to control the situation, to rewrite their story? Her feelings for him were still there, but so were her fears. She didn't want to lose herself again, not for Alexander or anyone else. The meeting ended with Grace still uncertain, torn between her lingering love for Alexander and her commitment to maintaining her independence. As she walked away from their conversation, she reflected on everything that had transpired, the choices she had made, the mistakes they had both made, and the road that lay ahead. Alexander, for his part, was resolute in his commitment to change. He understood that winning Grace back wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to prove himself, not through grand gestures, but through consistent action. The section closed with both Alexander and Grace standing at pivotal moments in their respective journeys. Grace was determined to continue her path of self-empowerment, to grow her business and focus on her own dreams. She kept her boundaries firm, yet remained open to the possibility of reconciliation. Alexander, too, had made a commitment, not just to Grace but to himself. He was determined to prove that he could be more than the man he had once been, to show Grace that he could support her without trying to control her. Their story was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. The tension between them remained, but there was hope. A hope that, one day, they might both find a way to build something new, something based on mutual respect, love, and the lessons they had learned along the way. As the days passed, Grace focused on her work, her business steadily gaining traction and attention. She had found her footing, the hard work and sacrifices she had made beginning to bear fruit. Her startup, once just an idea in the back of her mind, was now becoming a legitimate force in the market. As she navigated her new life, she encountered moments of doubt, wondering if her decisions had been the right ones, but each success reinforced her belief in herself. Ethan, ever the charming and calculating figure, continued to play a significant role in her rise. He was a master at making her feel seen and valued, always quick to praise her efforts and provide guidance. Yet, as the days went on, Grace began to notice the cracks in his seemingly perfect mentorship. Subtle signs of control began to surface. Ethan's insistence on taking credit for her achievements, his possessive nature creeping into their professional relationship. At first, she dismissed these moments, thinking they were just part of the business world. But as they became more frequent, Grace started to question his true intentions. Meanwhile, Alexander's journey of self-improvement was far from easy. He continued to isolate himself, spending countless hours in reflection, working through the emotional walls he had built around himself for so many years. He reached out to his employees, apologizing for his past behavior, and while some accepted his efforts, others remained skeptical, unable to forget the scars he had left behind. Alexander understood this. It was part of the process of rebuilding his life. He read books on emotional intelligence, sought mentorship from individuals he respected, and took real steps to ensure that he was no longer the man who had driven Grace away. Each day, he felt a little more human, a little more capable of change, and though the journey was difficult, he was committed to it. Yet, despite his progress, he couldn't help but feel the absence of Grace in his life. The memories of her, the moments they had shared, haunted him, reminding him of what he had lost. He had hoped that his public act of redemption would catch her attention, but the distance between them remained. He understood that his actions alone wouldn't be enough to win her back, but he was determined to prove that he had changed for the better. The story reached a turning point when Ethan crossed a line that would change everything. Emboldened by Grace's success and his growing influence over her, Ethan made a bold move. One evening, after a particularly successful business presentation, he confessed his romantic feelings for her. Grace was caught off guard. She had always respected Ethan as a mentor and valued his guidance, but this was something different. His words felt like a trap, an attempt to bind her closer to him, not just professionally, but personally. She had grown close to Ethan, yes, but she had never anticipated this. She wasn't sure what to make of it. Was this part of his game? Was it genuine? And if so, did she want any part of it? The confession left her feeling cornered, unsure of where her loyalty should lie. She didn't want to be used again, and she feared that Ethan, like Alexander before him, might be trying to control her, this time in a different way. This forced Grace to confront her feelings for both men, a confrontation she had been avoiding for a long time. She began to question everything she thought she knew about herself, about her goals, and about what she truly wanted. Was she ready for another relationship, especially one that seemed so entangled with business and power? The weight of her own ambitions and desires pulled her in multiple directions. She had worked so hard to build her independence, to carve out her own space in the world. Yet, the unresolved emotions from her past with Alexander lingered, and now, with Ethan's proposal, she felt torn between two paths. One that involved embracing her growing independence, and the other that risked compromising it for the sake of companionship, love, or even ambition. In an unexpected turn, Alexander's actions continued to speak louder than words. After Ethan's confession, Alexander, sensing that the situation was slipping further out of his control, took another bold step. Rather than trying to manipulate Grace through his power or wealth, he offered his genuine support. In private, he met with her and, for the first time, didn't ask for anything in return. He didn't try to win her back through grand gestures or promises of change. He simply listened. He spoke honestly about his mistakes, his regrets, and his desire to help her succeed, no matter where their relationship stood. His vulnerability was raw, and Grace saw him in a way she hadn't before. His apology wasn't just words. It was a shift in his entire being. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was acknowledging the past and giving Grace the space she needed to make her own decisions. This meeting didn't instantly change everything. Grace was still cautious, still unsure of what to make of it all. She had come so far on her own, and though she appreciated Alexander's growth, she wasn't ready to throw herself back into something that could again threaten her independence. Yet, as she reflected on their conversation, she began to see the subtle shifts in her feelings. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to Alexander or anyone else. She had built her life on her own terms, and that was something she would never give up. But at the same time, she couldn't completely shut out the possibility of reconciliation with Alexander. The love she had once felt for him still lingered in her heart, and that complicated matters further. The conflict raged inside her, and the uncertainty of the future weighed heavily on her. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when Grace realized the power she held in her own life. She had spent so much time focusing on the men around her, whether it was Alexander's control or Ethan's manipulation, that she had forgotten about her own strength. She didn't need anyone to define her success or her happiness. She had already proven to herself that she could stand on her own. With renewed determination, she made the decision to forge ahead with her business and her life. She would keep her boundaries firm and her goals clear, while still remaining open to the possibilities of the future. Alexander, too, was at a crossroads. He knew that his journey wasn't over, but he was finally at peace with who he was becoming. There was no longer a need to control the narrative or manipulate the outcome. He had learned to let go, to focus on being the best version of himself, not just for Grace but for his own sense of fulfillment. The future remained uncertain for both of them, but they were no longer the people they had once been. Grace was stronger, more independent, and ready to take on the world. Alexander was humbled, ready to support her without trying to possess her. The tension between them had not fully dissipated, but there was hope. There was the possibility of something new, something built on mutual respect, understanding, and transformation. Whether that would lead to a reunion or a continued path of growth apart, neither knew. But what was certain was that they both had changed, and that in itself was the beginning of something real. Ethan's suspicions were piqued when he discovered that Alexander had made moves to reconnect with Grace. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, and when he learned of Alexander's heartfelt apology to Grace, he became consumed by paranoia. The idea that Alexander, once so confident and domineering, was now vulnerable, seeking forgiveness and attempting to support Grace's startup, struck at the very core of Ethan's ego. Unable to accept this shift, he began digging into Alexander's actions, uncovering subtle maneuvers that indicated Alexander had been quietly assisting Grace's business. Whether it was through behind-the-scenes financial support or influential contacts, Ethan knew Alexander was playing a game that could potentially disrupt his carefully constructed power dynamics. Furious and threatened, Ethan began to devise a plan. He knew he couldn't allow Alexander to become a force in Grace's world again, both personally and professionally. The rivalry between them had always been fierce, but now it was bordering on something more dangerous. Ethan had never been one to back down from a challenge, and he saw Alexander's kindness as a weakness he could exploit. Determined to put Alexander in his place, Ethan launched a high-stakes takeover bid targeting one of Alexander's key ventures, a company that had been vital to the survival of his empire. This move was bold, risky even, but Ethan was desperate. He knew that destabilizing Alexander's business would be the best way to weaken him and ultimately eliminate his influence in Grace's life. He wasn't just fighting to win in business. He was fighting to maintain control, to keep Grace's attention, and to prove that his brand of power was the one she needed. Alexander, however, was prepared. He didn't see Ethan's attack coming, but once it arrived, he fought back with the resources and intellect that had made him a titan in the business world. He leveraged everything at his disposal, pulling strings, calling in favors, and outmaneuvering Ethan at every turn. The battle between them escalated quickly, spilling out into the public sphere. Media outlets picked up on the clash, painting it as a personal feud between two powerful men vying for the attention of the same woman. Grace, the unintentional prize, found herself at the center of this escalating storm, her relationship with both men under intense scrutiny. The spotlight was unbearable. It was a constant reminder of how her ambitions had made her a pawn in their game of egos. Each move, each tactic felt like it was orchestrated with her at the center, and she couldn't help but feel trapped between them. Finally, Grace had had enough. The tension had reached a boiling point, and she couldn't stand being the collateral damage in their ongoing feud. One afternoon, she called both Alexander and Ethan into a private meeting, determined to confront them both. She entered the room with a level of composure that surprised both men. Her voice was calm, but each word she spoke cut through the air like a knife. She told them, in no uncertain terms, that she would no longer allow them to use her as a pawn in their battle. Her loyalty was not to their egos or their power struggles. It was to herself, her dreams, and her independence. She demanded that they stop fighting over her, that they stop seeing her as the prize to be won, and that they focus on their own shortcomings instead of trying to drag her down with them. Her speech was powerful, and for the first time, both men were forced to listen. Ethan, who had always seen Grace as a means to an end, was taken aback by her courage. Alexander, who had always been the one in control, was forced to confront the fact that he had lost his hold over her. It was a moment of clarity for Grace. She was no longer a passive participant in their world. She was an active force in her own life. Amidst the chaos, Grace's startup reached a new milestone, one that further solidified her place in the business world. She had worked tirelessly to build something of her own, and now her efforts were paying off. Her innovative approach caught the attention of the business community, and soon, invitations to prestigious business panels began pouring in. She was recognized not as the woman caught in the middle of two men's rivalry, but as a self-made entrepreneur in her own right. Her business was thriving, and Grace was thriving with it. She had become the embodiment of everything she had once hoped for: independent, successful, and fully in control of her own narrative. Both Alexander and Ethan watched from the sidelines, unable to ignore the fact that Grace's brilliance was undeniable. She was no longer the accessory to their plans. She was a force in her own right, a powerful woman who no longer needed either of them to define her. Ethan, desperate to maintain control, began resorting to increasingly underhanded tactics to regain his upper hand. When Grace's success began to overshadow his own, he found himself scrambling to keep his power intact. He launched a smear campaign against Alexander, attempting to ruin his reputation by leaking false information about him to the media. But his manipulations quickly backfired. The evidence of his deceit was soon uncovered, and the business community quickly turned on him. The very tactics he had once used to climb to the top were now the source of his downfall. The media, who had once been his ally, now painted him as the villain in the story, highlighting his unethical actions and manipulations. Grace, disillusioned by Ethan's true nature, wasted no time in severing ties with him. She had been blind to his motivations before, but now she saw him clearly for who he truly was. A man driven by ego and control, willing to use anyone, especially her, to achieve his own ends. Both personally and professionally, she walked away from him, choosing to embrace her independence and the life she had built for herself. Meanwhile, Alexander was determined to prove to Grace and to himself that he had truly changed. After months of reflection and self-improvement, he knew that the only way to demonstrate his transformation was through action. He could no longer rely on grand gestures or empty promises. It was time for him to make a real sacrifice. In a move that stunned the business world, Alexander made the unprecedented decision to withdraw from a major business battle. A battle he could have easily won, one that would have left Ethan humiliated and defeated. By stepping back, Alexander forfeited the chance to ruin Ethan, and instead chose to act with compassion, prioritizing the well-being of others over his own ambition. This was the moment that truly signaled his change. He didn't need to win this time. All he needed was to prove that he could make a selfless decision, one that wasn't about crushing his rival or proving his superiority. The world watched as Alexander's act of redemption unfolded, and while some admired his gesture, others were skeptical. Grace, too, took note of the change. She had been watching from the sidelines, cautiously observing Alexander's efforts to rebuild his life. She had been hesitant to trust him again, unsure of whether his transformation was genuine or just another attempt to control the narrative. But as she witnessed his actions, something shifted inside her. She began to see the man he had become, not the one who had hurt her, but the man who was now willing to sacrifice his pride for the sake of others. She was torn, unsure of how to move forward. Could she forgive him for the past? And if so, could they truly build something together again without repeating the mistakes of the past? As time went on, Alexander's growth became more evident. He reached out to Grace, wanting to show her that his intentions were real. He delivered a heartfelt apology, not in a way that demanded forgiveness, but in a way that was truly about understanding the pain he had caused her. He spoke from a place of vulnerability, admitting to his flaws and the ways in which he had failed her. There were no grand gestures this time, no promises of forever. Instead, Alexander offered his support, his resources, and his influence, but with no strings attached. He wanted to help her achieve her dreams, to see her succeed on her own terms. This was the ultimate test of his transformation, not to win her back by force, but to prove that he could support her independence and let her choose her own path. Grace was deeply moved by his sincerity, but she remained cautious. She had spent so long fighting for her independence, building her own life, that she wasn't sure she could trust Alexander again. She needed to be sure that he had truly changed, and that his actions weren't just another attempt to control her. Still, she couldn't deny the changes she had seen in him. He had taken responsibility for his past mistakes, and he had shown a willingness to put her happiness before his own. But forgiveness for Grace was not something that came easily. It would take time, and it would require her to be vulnerable again, something she was still learning to do. The conflict between them simmered, but there was also a sense of hope. Alexander had proven that he was capable of change, and Grace, though still uncertain, was beginning to see that their relationship might have a future after all. But it wasn't a future built on control or manipulation. It was a future built on mutual respect, trust, and shared goals. As Grace continued to focus on her business, her personal growth, and her newfound independence, She realized that she didn't need to choose between her dreams and her heart. She could have both. And as for Ethan, his downfall was complete. Publicly humiliated and abandoned by the very person he had sought to control, Ethan was left to grapple with his failures. The once confident businessman was now a broken man, forced to confront the reality of his actions and the damage he had caused. He retreated from the public eye, just as Alexander once had, and began to reflect on the choices that had led him to this point. It was unclear what the future held for him, whether he would find redemption or continue down his path of self-destruction. But one thing was certain. The once powerful man who had tried to use others as stepping stones to his success was now standing on the edge of a new chapter in his life. The story of Grace and Alexander, however, was just beginning. As Grace continued to grow her business and Alexander remained committed to his transformation, they found themselves at a crossroads. Their journey together had been marked by pain, mistakes, and power struggles, but it was also a journey of growth, forgiveness, and healing. They had both learned hard lessons that would shape their future together. They would have to navigate the complexities of their relationship, ensuring that it was based on trust and mutual respect. But for the first time, they were both ready to face the future hand in hand, not as two people trapped by the past, but as two people who had learned how to move forward together. The road ahead for Grace and Alexander was uncertain, but there was a new sense of purpose in their steps. They had both grown in ways that neither could have predicted when their story first began. Grace had emerged from the ashes of her previous relationship, not just as a woman healing from heartbreak, but as a powerful, independent entrepreneur. Alexander, once driven by pride and power, had learned the true meaning of vulnerability and selflessness. It was a rare, fragile balance between them, built on mutual respect, trust, and an understanding that their individual paths were just as important as the one they shared. In the months that followed, Grace and Alexander worked side by side, not as lovers trying to reclaim a lost past, but as equals, partners in business and life. They pushed each other to reach new heights. But this time, there was no competition between them, no hidden agendas. Alexander supported Grace's startup with both his influence and resources, not because he wanted to control her, but because he believed in her potential. Grace, in turn, helped Alexander expand his business empire, bringing fresh ideas, new perspectives, and a sense of creativity he had once lost. Together, they formed a partnership that wasn't just about business. It was about the respect they had cultivated for one another and the way they had each transformed into better versions of themselves. Their relationship, though stronger, still had its moments of tension. There were times when old wounds resurfaced, and they had to confront the ghosts of their past. But instead of letting those moments tear them apart, they used them as opportunities to grow closer. They communicated openly about their fears, their hopes, and their dreams, knowing that their bond was now rooted in something much deeper than power or control. As their businesses flourished, they found themselves constantly challenging each other to be better. Alexander, who had once ruled his empire with an iron fist, was now learning to be a more empathetic leader. Grace, who had once been afraid to trust her instincts, was now confident in her decisions and ambitions. Together, they found a balance between love and work, carving out time for each other amidst their busy schedules. Their love was no longer about ownership. It was about partnership. They complemented each other in a way that neither had ever experienced before. One evening, after a particularly successful business meeting, Grace and Alexander found themselves walking through the city together, hand in hand. The lights of the city reflected in the glass windows of the towering buildings, and the hum of the bustling streets seemed to mirror the excitement of their own lives. The past was still a part of them, but it no longer defined them. They had both moved forward, individually and together, and the future now seemed full of endless possibilities. Their conversation was light, filled with laughter and shared stories about the progress they had made. As they passed a cafe, Grace stopped and glanced at the menu. "What do you think? Coffee?" she asked with a playful smile. Alexander nodded, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "I think we've earned it," They walked inside, the warmth of the cafe a stark contrast to the cool night air. As they sat across from each other, sipping their coffee, there was an unspoken understanding between them. No words were necessary. They were exactly where they needed to be. The evening marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that was not defined by the mistakes of the past or the toxic dynamics of their former relationship. It was a chapter built on transformation, on mutual respect, and on a love that had been forged through struggle and healing. And as they left the cafe, the weight of the past no longer felt so heavy. They were ready to step into the future, not just as a couple, but as two people who had found strength in each other's growth. In the distance, the city stretched out before them, a vast expanse of opportunity and potential. Together, Grace and Alexander were ready to take on whatever came next, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as equals. The story that had begun in turmoil had come full circle, with love, forgiveness, and hope paving the way for a future neither had ever imagined. Their shared laughter echoed through the streets as they walked hand in hand, confident in the power of transformation and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The future, filled with love, ambition, and the quiet strength of their bond, awaited them. And that was how their story ended. Not with a dramatic final moment, but with the peaceful, steady realization that they had found their way together.